The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window of our small rental house on Maple Street, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. I watched Emma struggle with her shoelaces, her small fingers fumbling with the knots as she sat cross-legged on the living room carpet. "Dad, they're being mean again," she said, her voice carrying that particular frustration I'd come to recognize. At 7 years old, Emma had learned that the world didn't always make sense to her the way it did to other kids. "What's being mean, sweetheart?" I asked, kneeling beside her on the carpet. The Alabama heat was already building outside, promising another scorching July day. "The laces. They won't stay tied like Mrs. Peterson showed us." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and I felt that familiar tightness in my chest. 6 months since her autism diagnosis, and I was still learning how to navigate her world. "Hey, look at me," I said, gently tilting her chin up. "Remember what we practiced? Sometimes things take extra tries, and that's okay." She nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. I helped her with the laces, making sure they were secure but not too tight. Emma had sensory issues with certain textures and pressures, something our pediatrician, Dr. Martinez, had explained was common for children on the spectrum. "There we go, Em, ready for church." Emma's face lit up with that brilliant smile that made everything worth it. "Will Miss Sarah be there today? She promised to show me the new coloring books." "I'm sure she will be." Sarah Collins was one of the few people at Riverside Baptist Church who truly understood Emma. A kindergarten teacher in her 50s, she had recognized the signs months before I'd even considered the possibility of autism. We walked the 6 blocks to church, Emma skipping beside me, her Sunday dress, a simple blue cotton one that didn't irritate her skin, flowing in the warm breeze. The streets of our neighborhood were quiet, lined with modest homes and pickup trucks parked in driveways. This was small-town Alabama at its core, tight-knit, traditional, and sometimes unforgiving of anyone who didn't fit the mold. Riverside Baptist Church stood at the corner of Main and Oak, its white steeple reaching toward the cloudless sky. The building had been there for over a century, and sometimes I wondered if some of the attitudes inside were just as old. "Morning, David, Emma," called out Mrs. Henderson from the church steps. She was arranging flowers in the entrance, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the humidity. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," I replied, guiding Emma toward the door. "Beautiful arrangements, as always." Emma tugged on my hand. "Dad, can I sit with Miss Sarah today?" "We'll see, sweetheart. Let's find our seats first." The sanctuary was filling up with familiar faces. The Johnson family occupied their usual pew near the front, their 3 well-behaved children sitting quietly with their hands folded. Behind them, the Millers nodded in our direction, their smiles polite but distant. Ever since Emma's diagnosis had become common knowledge, small towns have no secrets, I'd noticed the subtle shift in how people interacted with us. We found a seat in the middle section, close enough to hear Pastor Williams clearly, but far enough back to make a quick exit if Emma became overwhelmed. I'd learned to always have an escape plan. "David," a deep voice called from behind us. I turned to see Deacon Robert Mitchell approaching, his imposing frame filling the aisle. At 62, Mitchell had been a pillar of Riverside Baptist for over 30 years. His wife, Margaret, followed close behind, her expression tight with what I'd learned to recognize as controlled disapproval. "Robert." "Margaret," I nodded, instinctively placing a protective hand on Emma's shoulder. She had started humming quietly, a self-soothing behavior that helped her manage the sensory overload of the crowded church. "David, we need to talk about Emma's situation," Margaret said, her voice low, but carrying clearly in the acoustics of the sanctuary. "Her behavior last week was quite disruptive." My jaw tightened. The previous Sunday, Emma had experienced a meltdown when the choir's volume had suddenly increased during the opening hymn. She'd covered her ears and cried, and I'd quickly taken her outside to calm down. We'd returned after 10 minutes, but apparently that had been enough to warrant a discussion. "Emma wasn't being disruptive," I said carefully, keeping my voice level. "She was overwhelmed by the sudden noise. It's part of her autism." Robert's expression hardened. "Now, David, I understand you want to make excuses for the child, but there comes a point where discipline needs to take precedence over conditions." The word conditions dripped with skepticism, as if autism was something I'd invented to avoid parenting responsibilities. I felt my hands clench into fists, but I forced myself to remain calm. This was God's house, and Emma was watching. "It's not an excuse, Robert. It's a medical diagnosis from a qualified professional." Margaret interjected, her eyes narrow. "In my day, children learned to sit still and be quiet in church. Perhaps if Emma spent more time in proper Christian discipline classes instead of those therapy sessions. The therapy sessions are helping her, I said, my voice rising slightly before I caught myself. Several heads turned in our direction. Doctor Martinez and Emma's behavioral therapist have made significant progress with her sensory processing issues. Dad? Emma's voice was small, confused. She couldn't understand the adult conversation entirely, but she could sense the tension. Her humming had stopped, replaced by the subtle rocking movement that indicated rising anxiety. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered, rubbing her back gently. "Just grown-up talk." Robert leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than if he'd shouted. "David, I'm going to be frank with you. This church has standards. We can't have disruptions every Sunday because you refuse to discipline your child properly." "She's 7 years old, Robert. Old enough to learn respect for the Lord's house," Margaret added. "Perhaps it would be better if Emma stayed in the nursery with the younger children until she can behave appropriately." The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. Emma had been attending regular service for over a year. She loved the music, the stories, and especially the community feel of being included with the adults. Relegating her to the nursery would be like telling her she wasn't good enough, wasn't normal enough to worship with everyone else. "Emma belongs in the sanctuary," I said firmly. "She's a member of this congregation, and she has every right to be here." "Rights come with responsibilities," Robert said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to having his opinions accepted without question. "And if you can't teach her those responsibilities, then perhaps you should find a church more accommodating to your situation," Margaret finished. The organ began playing the opening notes of the first hymn, effectively ending our conversation. Robert and Margaret returned to their seats in the front row, but I could feel their disapproval radiating back toward us like heat from a furnace. Emma had gone very quiet, her small body tense against my side. I knew she'd absorbed more of the conversation than I'd hoped. Children on the spectrum often had difficulty with social cues, but they were incredibly perceptive about emotions and tensions. "Dad, are we in trouble?" she whispered, as the congregation rose for the opening hymn. "No, sweetheart, we're not in trouble." But as I watched Robert Mitchell take his place beside Pastor Williams at the front of the church, I couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was exactly what we were heading toward. The service began with "Amazing Grace," Emma's favorite hymn. She knew all the words and usually sang along with her sweet, slightly off-key voice. Today she remained silent, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her dress. Pastor Williams stepped up to the pulpit, his kind eyes scanning the congregation. At 45, he was younger than many of the church's leadership, and I'd always found him more understanding than some of the older members. He'd been supportive when I'd first explained Emma's diagnosis, even arranging for Sarah Collins to work with Emma during particularly challenging services. "Good morning, brothers and sisters," Pastor Williams began, his voice warm and welcoming. "Today we're going to talk about acceptance, about loving our neighbors as ourselves, about seeing past the surface to the heart that beats within." I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe today's sermon would help some of the congregation understand Emma better, help them see past her differences to the loving, intelligent child she was. But as Pastor Williams continued speaking about compassion and understanding, I noticed Robert Mitchell's jaw tightening. His wife sat rigid beside him, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Emma began to relax as the service progressed, even smiling during the children's story time. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking on thin ice, that one wrong move, one perceived disruption, would send us plunging into the cold water of rejection. I had no idea how right I was, or how soon that ice would break. The following Tuesday evening, I sat across from Dr. Elena Martinez in her office at the Huntsville Children's Development Center. Emma was in the waiting room with her behavioral therapist, Lisa, working on a puzzle that helped develop her fine motor skills. "How are things going at church?" Dr. Martinez asked, her pen poised over Emma's progress notes. At 38, she was one of the few pediatric specialists in our area who truly understood autism spectrum disorders. I rubbed my temples, feeling the tension headache that had been building since Sunday. "Not great. Some of the congregation members think Emma's behavior is problematic." "Problematic how?" "They want her to sit perfectly still and silent for 90 minutes. When she can't, they see it as defiance or poor parenting." I leaned back in the chair, exhausted. One of the deacons suggested she should stay in the nursery until she can behave appropriately. "Doctor," Martinez frowned, setting down her pen. "David, Emma has made tremendous progress in the 6 months since her diagnosis. Her sensory processing issues have improved significantly with therapy. She's learning coping strategies and self-regulation techniques. I know, I see it every day. But they don't understand that her autism isn't something she can just turn off for church. Have you considered talking to the pastor directly? Sometimes education can help bridge these gaps. I had considered it, but Pastor Williams was caught between his more progressive instincts and the traditional expectations of his long-time congregation. Riverside Baptist was funded largely by families like the Mitchells, who had been attending for decades. I'll think about it, I said, though I wasn't sure it would help. Thursday morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was getting ready for work. I managed the parts department at Henderson's Auto Repair when Emma called out from the living room. "Dad, there's a lady at the door." I opened it to find Margaret Mitchell standing on my porch, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. She wore a floral dress and carried a covered casserole dish. "Margaret, this is unexpected. May I come in, David? I brought you and Emma some chicken and rice casserole." Warily, I stepped aside to let her in. Emma peeked around the corner, then quickly disappeared back into the living room when she saw our visitor. "Coffee," I offered, though my instincts told me this wasn't a social call. "That would be lovely." We sat at my small kitchen table, the casserole dish between us like a peace offering. Margaret stirred her coffee slowly, her movements deliberate and measured. "David, I want to help you and Emma," she began. "I've been thinking about our conversation on Sunday, and I realize I may have come across as harsh." "Go on." "I've been talking to some of the other ladies in the church, and we've come up with a solution that might work for everyone." I felt my stomach tighten. "What kind of solution?" "Well, we think Emma might benefit from some additional guidance, Christian guidance. There's a wonderful program at Grace Fellowship across town that specializes in helping children with behavioral challenges. Emma doesn't have behavioral challenges. She has autism." Margaret's smile tightened. "Of course, dear. But sometimes these modern diagnoses can become crutches, don't you think? What that child needs is structure, discipline, and prayer. Grace Fellowship has had remarkable success with children who've been labeled as different." I set down my coffee cup harder than necessary. "Labeled? Margaret, Emma was diagnosed by a qualified pediatric neurologist after months of testing and observation. I'm not questioning the doctor's opinion, but sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways. Sometimes what we think is a medical condition is actually a spiritual matter." The implication hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "I think you should leave. David, please, I'm trying to help. Grace Fellowship has prayer sessions, intensive biblical counseling, and they've seen children completely healed from these kinds of afflictions. Autism isn't an affliction. It's not something that needs to be healed or prayed away." Margaret stood as well, her composure cracking slightly. "That child needs help, David. Real help. Not these secular therapy sessions that just enable her behavior." "Her behavior? You mean the way she processes sensory information, the way her brain works? Those aren't behaviors, Margaret. That's who she is. And who she is might not be appropriate for our congregation." The words hit me like a slap. Margaret seemed to realize she'd gone too far because she quickly gathered her purse and moved toward the door. "I'll pray for you both," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "I'll pray that you find the wisdom to get Emma the help she really needs." After she left, I found Emma sitting on the couch, her knees drawn up to her chest. She was rocking slightly, a sign that she was processing stress. "Dad, why doesn't that lady like me?" I sat beside her, pulling her into my arms. "She doesn't understand you, sweetheart. Some people have trouble with things that are different from what they're used to. But I'm not bad, am I?" "No, Emma, you're not bad. You're perfect exactly the way you are." But even as I said the words, I wondered if our small town would ever see her that way. Sunday came too quickly. I'd considered staying home, but Emma loved church, and I wasn't about to let fear drive us away from our community. We took our usual seats, and I noticed Sarah Collins give Emma a warm smile from across the aisle. The service began normally enough. Emma sat quietly during the opening hymns, her hands folded in her lap. She'd been practicing her church behavior all week, and I felt a surge of pride at how hard she was trying. Pastor Williams stepped up to the pulpit, and I noticed his usual warm smile seemed strained. He cleared his throat and began. "Today, I want to talk about acceptance, about loving our neighbors as ourselves, about seeing past differences to the heart that beats within." I felt hopeful again, thinking maybe our conversation with Dr. Martinez had been premature. Maybe the congregation was ready to listen, to learn. But then I noticed Robert Mitchell's expression. His face was stone cold, his jaw set in a hard line. He was staring directly at Emma, and something about his gaze made my protective instincts flare. 20 minutes into the sermon it happened. Emma had been doing so well, sitting quietly and listening, but when the air conditioning unit suddenly kicked on with a loud mechanical whir, she startled. The unexpected noise triggered her sensory processing issues, and she made a small sound of distress. It wasn't loud, it wasn't disruptive, it was barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning itself. But Robert Mitchell had heard it. He turned in his seat, his face contorted with anger, and something else, something that looked almost like disgust. Before I could react, before I could even process what was happening, he was moving. Robert stood up and walked down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the sanctuary. Pastor Williams paused mid-sentence, confusion crossing his face. The entire congregation turned to watch as Robert Mitchell approached our pew. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence of the church. Emma looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. She didn't understand what was happening, didn't realize that her small sound of distress had somehow offended this man. And then Robert Mitchell did something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. He raised his hand and struck my 7-year-old daughter across the face. The sound of his palm connecting with her cheek echoed through the sanctuary like a gunshot. Emma's head snapped to the side, and she let out a cry of pain and confusion. "Robert!" I shouted, lunging toward him, but he leaned down until his face was inches from Emma's. "She's possessed," he whispered, but his voice carried in the acoustics of the church. "That child is possessed by demons, and she's disrupting the Lord's house." Emma began to cry, not the meltdown cry I was used to, but the heartbroken sob of a child who'd been hurt by someone she should have been able to trust. The entire congregation sat in stunned silence. Margaret Mitchell had gone pale, her hand over her mouth. Pastor Williams stood frozen at the pulpit, his sermon forgotten. And in that moment, as I looked at my daughter's red, tear-stained face, as I saw the fear and confusion in her eyes, something inside me snapped. I stood up, my voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary. "How dare you!" The silence in the sanctuary was deafening. 200 pairs of eyes stared at me as I stood in that pew, my daughter sobbing beside me, her small hand pressed against her reddened cheek. "How dare you?" I repeated, my voice stronger now, carrying to every corner of Riverside Baptist Church. "How dare you lay a hand on my child?" Robert Mitchell stepped back, but his face remained defiant. "That child was disrupting—" "She made a sound," I interrupted, my voice rising. "A 7-year-old girl with autism made a sound because the air conditioning startled her, and you think that gives you the right to hit her?" Margaret Mitchell stood up from the front pew, her face flushed. "David, please. Robert was just trying to maintain order in the Lord's house." "Order?" I helped Emma to her feet, keeping my arm around her trembling shoulders. "You call striking a disabled child maintaining order?" "She's not disabled," Robert said, his voice booming through the sanctuary. "She's undisciplined. There's a difference." I felt something break inside me, like a dam bursting after holding back floodwaters for too long. 6 months of whispered comments, disapproving looks, and barely concealed suggestions that Emma didn't belong here. 6 months of trying to be the polite, accommodating single father who didn't want to make waves. "You want to know what Emma's disability looks like?" I said, my voice carrying clearly in the perfect acoustics of the century-old church. "Let me tell you." Pastor Williams stepped forward from the pulpit. "David, perhaps we should—" "No," I held up my hand. "You all want to judge my daughter. You want to whisper about her behind our backs. Then you're going to hear the truth." Emma was still crying, but she leaned into my side, trusting me to protect her. That trust gave me the courage to continue. "Emma has autism spectrum disorder. It's a neurological condition that affects how she processes sensory information. When that air conditioning unit kicked on, it created a sound frequency that literally hurt her ears. She made a small sound of distress. Not a tantrum, not defiance, but pain." I looked around the sanctuary, making eye contact with faces I'd known for 2 years. The Johnsons, who'd stopped inviting Emma to their children's birthday parties. The Millers, who'd suggested I find a special needs church. The Hendersons, who'd asked if Emma's condition was contagious. "She's been going to therapy twice a week for 6 months, I continued. "Speech therapy to help with her communication, occupational therapy to help with her sensory processing, and behavioral therapy to learn coping strategies. Do you know what she's learned?" The congregation sat in stunned silence. Some looked uncomfortable, others angry. A few, Sarah Collins among them, were nodding encouragingly. She's learned to recognize when she's becoming overwhelmed and to use breathing techniques to calm herself. She's learned to ask for help when she needs it. She's learned that it's okay to be different, that God made her exactly the way she's supposed to be. Margaret Mitchell's voice cut through the sanctuary. David, we understand you love your daughter, but, nothing. I turned to face her directly. You came to my house on Thursday. You brought a casserole and suggestions for programs that would heal my daughter. You told me her autism was a spiritual problem that needed to be prayed away. Gasps echoed through the sanctuary. Several people turned to stare at Margaret, who had gone very pale. You want to know what's really a spiritual problem? I continued. Adults who think it's acceptable to hit a child. Adults who believe that being different is the same as being defective. Adults who preach about loving your neighbor on Sunday morning and then suggest that some neighbors aren't welcome in God's house. Robert Mitchell's face was red with anger. You're out of line, Thompson. This is the Lord's house and there are standards. Standards, I laughed, but there was no humor in it. What standards? The standard that says it's okay to physically assault a 7-year-old? The standard that says children with disabilities should be hidden away because they make you uncomfortable? I looked up at Pastor Williams, who stood frozen at the pulpit. Pastor, 6 months ago, you told me that Emma was welcome here. You said this was a place where all of God's children could worship together. Was that true, or were you just being polite? Pastor Williams opened his mouth, then closed it. The conflict was written across his face, his genuine desire to be inclusive warring with the pressure from his longtime congregation members. David, perhaps we should discuss this privately. No, I shook my head. Emma and I are done with private discussions. We're done with whispered conversations and suggestions that we find somewhere else to worship. We're done with being made to feel like we're the problem. I turned back to the congregation, my voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. You want to know what Emma does during these services? She listens to every word of Pastor Williams' sermons. She knows all the Bible stories from Children's Church. She prays every night for her friends, for her teachers, for all of you. She asks God to help her be better, to help her understand why some people are mean to her. My voice broke slightly on the last words, but I pushed through. She's 7 years old, and she's already learned more about forgiveness and acceptance than most adults ever will. She doesn't understand why making a small sound when she's in pain is wrong. She doesn't understand why being different makes some people angry. I looked directly at Robert Mitchell, who was standing rigid in the aisle, but she understands that hitting is wrong. She understands that adults are supposed to protect children, not hurt them, and she understands that what you just did was cruel. The sanctuary was so quiet, I could hear the air conditioning unit humming, the same sound that had started this whole confrontation. Emma, I said softly, kneeling down to her level, tell everyone how you feel right now. She looked up at me with her big, tear-filled eyes. Scared, she whispered, and my face hurts. I stood up, lifting her into my arms. At 7, she was getting too big to carry, but I needed to hold her, to show her that I would always be there to protect her. You see this child? I said to the congregation. This beautiful, intelligent, loving child? She's not possessed. She's not defective. She's not a problem to be solved. She's exactly who God made her to be. Margaret Mitchell stood up again, her voice shaking with emotion. David, we're trying to help. We're trying to suggest resources. Resources, I interrupted. You suggested a program that believes autism can be prayed away. You suggested that Emma's neurological condition is a spiritual failing. You suggested that I'm a bad parent because I won't try to force her to be someone she's not. I looked around the sanctuary one more time, at the faces of people I'd thought were my community. I've spent 6 months trying to make Emma fit into your idea of what a normal child should be. I've apologized for her stimming, for her sensory needs, for the way her brain processes information. I've made her practice sitting still and quiet at home, even when it causes her distress. Emma buried her face in my shoulder, and I felt her tears soaking through my shirt. But I'm done apologizing for who she is. I'm done trying to make her small enough to fit into your narrow definition of acceptable, and I'm done exposing her to people who think it's okay to hurt her. I started walking toward the aisle, carrying Emma with me. As I passed Robert Mitchell, he stepped forward. You're making a mistake, Thompson. This community has been good to you. Don't throw it away over a child's tantrum. I stopped and turned to face him, my voice deadly quiet. If you ever come near my daughter again, if you even look at her wrong, I will have you arrested for child abuse. And that's not a threat, Robert. That's a promise. The sanctuary erupted in murmurs and gasps. Some people looked shocked, others angry, but I was beyond caring about their reactions. I walked up the aisle carrying Emma, my footsteps echoing in the sudden cacophony of voices. As I reached the door, I turned back one last time. "Pastor Williams," I called out, my voice carrying over the noise, "you have a choice to make. You can continue to enable people like Robert Mitchell, or you can actually practice what you preach about loving your neighbor." I paused, looking out over the congregation. "But Emma and I won't be here to see what you decide. We're done." And with that, I walked out of Riverside Baptist Church, carrying my daughter into the bright Alabama sunshine, leaving behind the only faith community we'd ever known. The walk home from church felt like the longest 6 blocks of my life. Emma had stopped crying, but she remained silent, her small arms wrapped around my neck as I carried her. The Alabama sun beat down mercilessly, and I could feel sweat soaking through my dress shirt. But I didn't want to put her down, not yet. "Dad," she whispered as we turned onto Maple Street. "Yes, sweetheart. Are we in trouble with God?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I stopped walking and sat down on Mrs. Peterson's front porch steps, keeping Emma in my lap. "No, Em, we're not in trouble with God." "Why would you think that?" "Because Mr. Mitchell said I was possessed, and we left church. Isn't that bad?" I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. How do you explain religious hypocrisy to a 7-year-old? How do you tell a child that the adult she's supposed to trust can be cruel and wrong? "Emma, look at me." I tilted her chin up so she could see my face. "Mr. Mitchell was wrong. You're not possessed. You're not bad. You're exactly who you're supposed to be." "But why did he hit me?" "Because he doesn't understand autism, because he's scared of things that are different, and because he forgot that Jesus said we should love children, not hurt them." Emma considered this, her brow furrowed in concentration. "So we're not in trouble with God. But Mr. Mitchell is." "I think God is pretty upset with Mr. Mitchell right now, yes?" That seemed to satisfy her, and we continued the walk home in comfortable silence. But as we reached our small rental house, I saw a familiar car parked in the driveway, Dr. Martinez's silver Honda. She was sitting on our front porch, still wearing her church clothes. She attended the Methodist church across town. Her expression was a mixture of concern and barely contained anger. "Elena," I said, setting Emma down, "what are you doing here?" "Sarah Collins called me," she said, standing up. "She told me what happened at church. Are you both okay?" Emma ran to Dr. Martinez, who knelt down to examine the fading red mark on her cheek. "He hit me," Emma said simply. "It hurt." "I'm sure it did, sweetheart." Dr. Martinez's voice was gentle, but I could see the fury in her eyes. "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" As Emma recounted the morning's events in her matter-of-fact way, I watched Dr. Martinez's expression grow darker. When Emma finished, Dr. Martinez stood up and faced me. "David, you need to file a police report." "I know. I was planning to do that tomorrow." "No, not tomorrow, now, today. What Robert Mitchell did was assault on a minor. The fact that Emma has autism makes it even more serious. It's assault on a disabled child." I felt my stomach clench. "Eleanor, I don't want to make this into a bigger thing than it already is." "Bigger thing." Her voice rose slightly. "David, a grown man struck your daughter in front of 200 witnesses because she made a sound. This is already a big thing." She was right, of course, but the thought of dragging Emma through a legal process, of having to relive this trauma over and over, made me feel sick. "Let me make some calls," Dr. Martinez continued. "I know people in the district attorney's office, child advocacy groups. This can't be swept under the rug." "Dad, what's a police report?" Emma asked, tugging on my sleeve. I knelt down beside her. "It's when we tell the police what happened so they can make sure it doesn't happen again." "Will they arrest Mr. Mitchell?" "I don't know, sweetheart, maybe." Emma nodded solemnly. "Good, he shouldn't hit kids." Out of the mouths of babes. Dr. Martinez made her calls while I got Emma settled with her favorite puzzle and a snack. Within an hour, Detective Lisa Warren from the Marshall County Sheriff's Office was sitting in our living room, taking Emma's statement. Detective Warren was a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put Emma at ease. She had experience with children on the autism spectrum, and she knew how to ask questions without overwhelming Emma. "Emma, you're being very brave," Detective Warren said, as she finished writing in her notebook. "Is there anything else you remember about what happened?" Emma thought for a moment. "He said I was possessed. What does that mean?" Detective Warren glanced at me, then back at Emma. "It means he said something that wasn't true. You're not possessed, Emma. You're just Emma." That's what Dad said too. Your dad is very smart. After Detective Warren left, promising to follow up within the week, I tried to settle into our normal Sunday routine. But everything felt different now. The house felt smaller, quieter. Emma seemed subdued, spending most of the afternoon curled up on the couch with her weighted blanket. The phone started ringing around 4 o'clock. The first call was from my boss, Jim Henderson, who'd heard about the incident from his wife. "David, I'm sorry about what happened. If you need time off to deal with this, just let me know." The second call was from Emma's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez. "I heard what happened at church. Emma is such a sweet child. If there's anything I can do to help." The third call was from Sarah Collins. "David, I am so sorry. I should have said something sooner. I should have stood up to Robert Mitchell months ago." But then the calls took a different tone. "Mr. Thompson, this is Janet Miller from the church. I think you owe Robert Mitchell an apology. He was trying to help your daughter, and you embarrassed him in front of the entire congregation." "David, this is Frank Johnson. I think you overreacted today. Maybe you should consider some anger management classes." "Mr. Thompson, this is Betty Sue Crawford. I've been thinking about what you said today, and I think you need to remember that Robert Mitchell is a good Christian man who's devoted his life to the church. Maybe you should look at your own heart before you go casting stones." By evening, I'd stopped answering the phone. Emma had retreated to her room, overwhelmed by the constant ringing and the tension she could sense in the house. I was making dinner when there was a knock at the door. Through the peephole, I saw Pastor Williams standing on my porch, looking uncomfortable and tired. "Pastor," I said, opening the door but not inviting him in. "David, I need to talk to you about what happened today." I think I said everything I needed to say. "Please, just give me 5 minutes." Against my better judgment, I let him in. Emma was in her room, and I wanted to keep it that way. "David, I want you to know that I don't condone what Robert did. Hitting a child is never acceptable." "But," Pastor Williams sighed, "but the way you handled it, standing up in the middle of service, airing private grievances in front of the entire congregation, that wasn't appropriate either." I felt the anger rising in my chest again. "Private grievances? Robert Mitchell assaulted my daughter in front of 200 people, and you think my response was inappropriate? I think there were better ways to handle it. We could have talked privately, worked something out. Like we've been doing for the past 6 months? Like when Margaret Mitchell came to my house and suggested Emma needed to be healed of her autism?" Pastor Williams looked genuinely surprised. "Margaret did what?" "She suggested I take Emma to some program that would pray away her autism. She said it might be a spiritual problem rather than a medical one." "David, I had no idea. Margaret never mentioned—" "Of course she didn't, because then you'd have to decide whether to address it or ignore it. And it's easier to ignore it." Pastor Williams was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want me to do, David? Robert Mitchell has been a pillar of this church for 30 years. His family has donated hundreds of thousands of dollars. You can't just what? Hold him accountable for hitting a child? It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple." I stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "Pastor, you have a choice to make. You can stand up for what's right or you can protect your donors, but you can't do both." Pastor Williams stood as well, his shoulders sagging. "David, I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry about what happened to Emma, but I hope you'll reconsider your decision to leave the church. We can work through this." "No," I said firmly, "we can't, because working through this would require your congregation to acknowledge that Emma belongs there, that she has value, that she deserves to be treated with respect. And based on the phone calls I've been getting all afternoon, that's not going to happen." After Pastor Williams left, I found Emma in her room sitting on her bed with her favorite stuffed animal, a blue elephant named Peanut. "Dad, are we going to find a new church?" I sat down beside her on the bed. "Do you want to find a new church?" Emma thought about it seriously. "Will the new church have people who hit kids?" "No, sweetheart. If we find a new church, it'll be one where everyone is kind to everyone else. Even to kids with autism?" "Especially to kids with autism." Emma nodded. "Then yes, I want to find a new church, but can we make sure they have good coloring books?" I laughed for the first time all day. "I'll make sure they have the best coloring books." As I tucked Emma into bed that night, she looked up at me with her big, serious eyes. "Dad, tomorrow at school if someone asks me about church, what should I say?" I thought about it. "You should tell them the truth, that some people at our old church weren't very nice to you, so we're going to find a new church where everyone is kind. And if they ask about Mr. Mitchell hitting me, you tell them that hitting is wrong and that grown-ups who hit kids need to learn better behavior." Emma giggled at that. "Like a timeout? Like a very long time out, as I turned off her bedroom light, Emma called out one more time, "Dad, I'm glad you stood up for me today, even though it was scary. I'll always stand up for you, Em. Always." But as I sat in the living room that night, listening to the phone ring with call after call from angry church members, I wondered if standing up had been enough, or if the real fight was just beginning. 3 weeks after the incident at Riverside Baptist, I sat in my truck outside Grace Community Church in Huntsville, watching families walk through the front doors. Emma was beside me, fidgeting with her seatbelt and looking nervous. "Dad, what if they don't like me either?" I turned to face her, seeing my own anxiety reflected in her eyes. "Then we'll leave and find another church. But Dr. Martinez recommended this place specifically because they have experience with kids like you. Kids with autism? Kids who are amazing just the way they are." The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind. The police investigation into Robert Mitchell's assault had moved forward quickly, thanks in part to the 200 witnesses and Detective Warren's thoroughness. The district attorney's office had filed charges of simple assault and child endangerment, but the legal process was only part of our new reality. The story had spread beyond our small town, picked up by local news stations and autism advocacy groups. My phone had been ringing constantly, reporters wanting interviews, support groups offering resources, and unfortunately, plenty of people from Riverside Baptist expressing their opinions about my overreaction. "Mr. Thompson," a woman's voice called out as we sat in the truck. I looked up to see a tall woman with short gray hair approaching our vehicle. She was wearing a simple sundress and a warm smile. I rolled down the window. "Yes? I'm Pastor Jennifer Hayes. Dr. Martinez told me you might be visiting us today. I wanted to personally welcome you and Emma." I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. Pastor Hayes had an immediate warmth about her that put me at ease. "Thank you. We're a little nervous." "That's completely understandable. Would you like me to show you around before the service starts? Sometimes it helps to get familiar with the space." Emma perked up. "Can we see where the kids sit?" "Absolutely. And Emma, we have something special for kids who might need a quieter space during the service. Would you like to see that too?" As we walked through Grace Community Church, I was struck by how different it felt from Riverside Baptist. The sanctuary was modern and bright, with comfortable seating arranged in a semicircle rather than rigid pews. But more importantly, I noticed the people. A teenage boy with Down syndrome was helping arrange chairs, his mother working beside him with obvious pride. A family with a child who was clearly on the autism spectrum, he was wearing noise-cancelling headphones and carrying a sensory toy, was greeted warmly by several other families. "We have about 15 families with children who have various disabilities," Pastor Hayes explained as we walked. "Autism, ADHD, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome. We've learned that when we make church accessible for everyone, it becomes a richer experience for all of us." She showed us the sensory room, a small space adjacent to the sanctuary with large windows that allowed families to see and hear the service while providing a quiet environment for children who might become overwhelmed. "Emma, you can choose where you want to sit," Pastor Hayes said, kneeling down to Emma's level. "Some kids like to sit in the main sanctuary, some prefer the sensory room, and some like to move back and forth as they need to. Whatever makes you comfortable." Emma looked around thoughtfully. "Can I try the big room first?" "Of course." As the service began, I found myself relaxing for the first time in weeks. Pastor Hayes' sermon was about acceptance and celebrating differences, but it didn't feel performative or forced. It felt genuine, lived in, like a community that had already done the hard work of learning to love their neighbors. Emma made it through most of the service in the main sanctuary. When the music got a little loud during the closing hymn, she tugged on my sleeve. "Dad, can we go to the quiet room now?" "Of course, sweetheart." As we moved to the sensory room, several people smiled and nodded at us. No one stared. No one looked disapproving. It was such a simple thing, but after months of feeling judged at Riverside Baptist, it felt revolutionary. After the service, we were approached by several families. Maria Santos introduced herself and her son Miguel, who was 8 and had autism. "Miguel loves making new friends," Maria said. "Would Emma like to see his Pokemon cards?" Within minutes, Emma and Miguel were deep in conversation about their shared interests, and I found myself talking with other parents who understood the daily challenges and joys of raising children with disabilities. "You're the family from the news story, aren't you?" asked Janet Wilson, whose daughter Sarah used a wheelchair. "I saw the interview Dr. Martinez gave about what happened at your old church." I tensed, expecting judgment or questions, but Janet's expression was sympathetic. I'm sorry that happened to Emma, and I'm glad you found us. This place has been a blessing for our family. As we drove home, Emma was more animated than I'd seen her in weeks. Dad, Miguel's mum said they have a playgroup for kids with autism every Tuesday. Can we go? If you want to, absolutely. And Pastor Jennifer said they're going to do a whole sermon series about how God makes everyone different on purpose. She asked if I wanted to help with the children's story one Sunday. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. How do you feel about that? Excited and a little nervous, but good nervous, not scared nervous. That afternoon, while Emma played in the backyard, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and my phone. I'd been avoiding the news coverage of our story, but curiosity finally got the better of me. The local news station's website had posted a follow-up story. Church assault case sparks community discussion about disability acceptance. The article included a statement from Riverside Baptist Church's Board of Directors. While we do not condone any form of violence against children, we believe this situation has been blown out of proportion. Mr. A. Thompson's public outburst and subsequent media attention have unfairly characterized our congregation. We remain committed to welcoming all families who are willing to work within our community standards. I snorted. Community standards was apparently code for hide your disability and don't make us uncomfortable. But the article also included responses from disability advocacy groups, autism organizations, and other churches in the area expressing support for Emma and our family. Grace Community Church was mentioned specifically as an example of inclusive worship. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Martinez. Saw the news article. How was church this morning? I typed back, good, really good. Emma wants to help with a children's sermon. That's wonderful. She's been through so much, but she's resilient. How are you doing? That was a harder question to answer. Professionally, things had been surprisingly positive. The story had brought attention to Henderson's auto repair, and Jim Henderson had been vocal in his support of our family. Business was actually up, but emotionally, I was still processing everything that had happened. The betrayal by people I'd thought were friends, the realization that the community I'd tried to fit into had never really accepted us, the fear that I'd somehow failed Emma by exposing her to that environment for so long. Still figuring that out, I texted back. The following Tuesday, I took Emma to the autism playgroup at Grace Community Church. The group met in the church's fellowship hall, which had been set up with various stations, sensory play, art activities, quiet reading areas, and space for more active play. There were 8 kids ranging in age from 5 to 12, each with their own support needs and interests. Emma gravitated immediately toward the art station, where a girl named Sophie was working on a detailed drawing of horses. I like your horses, Emma said shyly. Thanks. I'm drawing my therapy horse, Midnight. Do you like horses? I like all animals, but I've never ridden a horse. Maybe your dad could take you to the stable where I ride. They have programs for kids like us. Kids like us. The phrase struck me as I watched the children interact. There was no othering here, no sense that autism was something to be hidden or ashamed of. It was simply part of who they were. The parents were equally welcoming. I found myself in conversation with David Kim, whose son Jason was 10 and had been diagnosed with autism 3 years earlier. It takes time to find your tribe, David said, watching Jason and Emma collaborate on a puzzle. But when you do, it makes all the difference. How do you deal with the judgment from other people? I asked. The stares, the comments, the unsolicited advice. David smiled ruefully. You learn to distinguish between ignorance and malice. Ignorance you can educate. A malice you just have to walk away from. And what was Robert Mitchell? Malice, David said without hesitation, and you were right to walk away. As the weeks passed, Emma and I settled into new routines. Grace Community Church became our Sunday home, and Emma thrived in the accepting environment. She made friends, participated in children's activities, and slowly regained the confidence that had been shaken at Riverside Baptist. The legal case against Robert Mitchell moved forward. Detective Warren kept us informed of the progress, and the district attorney's office was confident they had a strong case. But I was surprised when Detective Warren called with unexpected news. David, I wanted to give you a heads up. Robert Mitchell's attorney has reached out about a plea deal. What kind of plea deal? He'd plead guilty to simple assault, pay a fine, and attend anger management classes. No jail time. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. And if we don't accept the plea, then it goes to trial, which means Emma would have to testify. The thought of putting Emma through a trial, of having her relive the trauma in front of strangers, made me feel sick. But the thought of Robert Mitchell getting away with just a fine made me angry. I need to think about it. Of course, talk to Emma's therapist. Talk to Dr. Martinez. You don't have to decide right away. That evening, I spoke with Dr. Martinez about the plea deal. Her advice was practical and child-focused. The goal should be Emma's well-being, not punishment for Robert Mitchell. She's doing so well now, building confidence, making friends. A trial could set that back significantly. But what about accountability? What about making sure this doesn't happen to another child? David, you've already done that. The story has been covered extensively. Riverside Baptist has been forced to examine their policies. Other churches in the area have reached out to autism advocacy groups to improve their accessibility. Emma's experience is already protecting other children. I knew she was right, but it still felt like letting Robert Mitchell off easy. The decision was made for me when Emma herself brought it up. We were having dinner when she asked out of nowhere, "Dad, is Mr. Mitchell going to jail?" "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe. Would that make you feel better?" Emma considered this seriously, the way she considered all important questions. "I think he should have to learn why hitting kids is wrong, but I don't want to have to see him again." "You wouldn't have to see him if he goes to jail. But I might have to see him if we go to court, right?" Her insight surprised me. "Yes, you might. Then I don't want to go to court. I just want him to learn better." And that settled it. A month later, Robert Mitchell pled guilty to simple assault. He was fined $5,000, ordered to complete 100 hours of community service at a disability advocacy organization, and required to attend anger management classes. It wasn't everything I'd wanted, but it was justice of a sort. More importantly, Emma was thriving. She was sleeping better, laughing more, and had stopped asking if she was bad or different in a negative way. Grace Community Church had given her something Riverside Baptist never could, a sense of belonging exactly as she was. On a Sunday in late August, Emma participated in her first children's sermon at Grace Community Church. Pastor Hayes had asked her to help tell the story of the Good Samaritan, and Emma had practiced for weeks. Standing in front of the congregation, holding the microphone with both hands, Emma spoke in her clear, earnest voice. The Good Samaritan helped someone who was different from him. He didn't ask if the hurt man was the right kind of person, or if he belonged there. He just helped because helping is what good people do. She paused, looking out at the congregation with her serious 7-year-old expression. Sometimes people are mean to kids like me, because we're different. But Jesus said we should love everyone, especially people who are different, because that's how we show God's love. The congregation erupted in applause, and I felt tears streaming down my face. This was my daughter, confident, articulate, and wise beyond her years, sharing her truth with a community that celebrated her exactly as she was. After the service, as families gathered in the fellowship hall for coffee and conversation, Emma ran up to me with shining eyes. "Dad, did you hear how loud they clapped?" "I did, sweetheart. You did amazing. Mrs. Santos said I should think about being a pastor when I grow up." I laughed. "What do you think about that?" Emma considered it seriously. "I think I'd like to help other kids like me feel welcome in church. That would be a good job." As I watched her run off to play with Miguel and Sophie, I realized that our journey through pain and rejection had led us to something better than what we'd lost. We'd found our tribe, our community, our place where Emma could be exactly who God made her to be, and that was worth everything we'd been through. 1 year later, I stood in the kitchen of our new house on Elm Street, watching Emma pack her backpack for school. At 8 years old, she had grown taller, more confident and more articulate about her needs and feelings. The move to Huntsville had been the right decision. Better schools, more resources, and most importantly, a community that embraced differences. "Dad, don't forget I have therapy with Miss Lisa after school," Emma said, carefully placing her noise-canceling headphones in her backpack's side pocket. "And then we're going to church tonight for the planning meeting." I smiled at her organizational skills. Emma had developed impressive executive functioning strategies over the past year, partly through therapy and partly through pure determination. "I won't forget. Are you excited about the presentation tonight?" Emma's face lit up. "Yes." Miguel's mom helped us make the poster board, and Pastor Jennifer said the denomination leaders are really interested in our ideas. The presentation Emma was referring to was part of a larger initiative. Grace Community Church had been selected as a pilot program for the Southern Baptist Convention's new inclusive worship guidelines. Emma, along with several other children and their families, would be presenting their experiences and recommendations to denominational leaders. It was a far cry from where we'd been a year ago. The phone rang. interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. Hello? David Thompson. This is Sarah Collins. Franson from Riverside Baptist. I felt my stomach tighten. Sarah had been one of the few people at our old church who had understood Emma, but we hadn't spoken since the incident. Sarah, hi. How are you? I'm calling because I wanted you to know what's been happening here. After you left, I glanced at Emma, who was still focused on her backpack. Okay. David, there's been a lot of changes. Pastor Williams resigned 3 months ago. The board brought in an interim pastor, and she's been asking hard questions about how we treat families with special needs. Pastor Rebecca Martinez, Dr. Martinez's sister, actually. She's been working with disability advocacy groups, and she specifically mentioned Emma's case as an example of how churches can fail families. I sat down at the kitchen table, processing this information. What about the Mitchells? Sarah's voice became quieter. Robert stepped down from all leadership positions. He and Margaret, they've been attending a different church across town. Some other families left too, the ones who supported Robert's actions. And the ones who stayed? We've started a special needs ministry. We've brought in consultants to train our volunteers. We've made physical modifications to the sanctuary. David, we're trying to do better. I wasn't sure how to respond. Part of me felt vindicated, but another part just felt sad about the whole situation. Sarah, I appreciate you telling me this, but I'm not calling to ask you to come back, Sarah interrupted. I know too much has happened for that. I'm calling because Pastor Martinez wants to invite Emma to speak to our congregation about her experience, about what churches can do better. I looked at Emma, who was now listening to our conversation with obvious interest. I'd have to ask Emma how she feels about that. Dad, who's that? Emma asked. I covered the phone. Miss Sarah from our old church. She's asking if you'd want to talk to the people there about autism and church. Emma's expression grew serious. Would Mr. Mitchell be there? I asked Sarah, and she confirmed that the Mitchells no longer attended Riverside Baptist. What would I tell them? Emma asked. You'd tell them about what it's like to be a kid with autism in church, about what helps and what doesn't help. Emma thought about it for a long moment. Would it help other kids like me? It might. Then yes, I want to do it. 2 weeks later, I found myself sitting in the front pew of Riverside Baptist Church, watching Emma stand at the same pulpit where Pastor Williams had once preached about acceptance, while his congregation practiced rejection. The sanctuary looked the same, but the atmosphere felt different. There were sensory-friendly modifications, softer lighting options, a quiet room similar to Grace Communities, and visual cues to help children understand the service structure. Pastor Rebecca Martinez introduced Emma with genuine warmth, explaining that Emma was there to help the congregation understand autism and how to be more welcoming to neurological differences. Emma took the microphone with steady hands. Over the past year, she had become comfortable speaking in front of groups, having participated in several autism awareness events and church presentations. Hi everyone, my name is Emma Thompson, and I have autism. Her voice carried clearly through the sanctuary, confident and clear. A year ago, I used to come to this church with my dad. I liked the music and the Bible stories, but I was scared a lot of the time because I didn't know if people would be nice to me or not. I saw several people in the congregation shift uncomfortably, including some faces I recognized from that terrible Sunday. Having autism means my brain works differently from other kids' brains. Sometimes sounds are really loud to me when they're normal to you. Sometimes I need to move around to help my body feel better. Sometimes I make noises when I'm scared or excited. Emma paused, looking around the sanctuary with the same serious expression she'd had as a 7-year-old. None of those things mean I'm bad or that I don't love God. They just mean I'm different, and being different isn't wrong. She went on to explain, in 8-year-old terms, what autism actually was, dispelling myths about vaccines, bad parenting, and spiritual problems. She talked about her therapy, her coping strategies, and her dreams for the future. I want to be a veterinarian when I grow up, she said, or maybe a pastor like Pastor Jennifer at my new church. I want to help animals or help kids like me feel welcome in God's house. Then Emma did something I hadn't expected. She looked directly at the section where the Hendersons sat. They'd been among the families who'd made subtle comments about Emma's behavior. Mrs. Henderson, I remember when you used to arrange flowers at the front of the church. They were always really pretty, but I was afraid to tell you that because I thought you didn't like me. Mrs. Henderson's face crumpled, and I saw tears in her eyes. Now I know that sometimes grown-ups don't understand kids with autism, and that makes them scared or uncomfortable. But kids with autism aren't scary. We're just kids who need a little extra understanding. Emma concluded her presentation by reading a poem she'd written, "God made me with autism, and that's perfectly fine. My brain works different, but my heart loves divine. I want to go to church and sing and pray and learn, but I need people to be kind and give respect in return. If you see a kid like me who stims or flaps or rocks, don't stare or whisper meanly, just smile and say, 'Hi, thanks.'" The sanctuary was completely silent when she finished. Then, slowly, applause began. It started with Sarah Collins and spread throughout the congregation, growing louder and more sustained than any applause I'd ever heard at Riverside Baptist. When Emma returned to her seat beside me, she was beaming. "Dad, did you see?" Mrs. Henderson was crying happy tears. After the service, we were surrounded by congregation members wanting to apologize, to learn more, to share their own family experiences with disability. Mrs. Henderson approached us directly. "Emma, honey, I owe you an apology. I was afraid of what I didn't understand, and I let that fear make me unkind. Your flowers, your words today, they were the most beautiful thing I've heard in this sanctuary in years." Emma, with the forgiveness that came naturally to her, hugged Mrs. Henderson. "It's okay. Now you know better, so you can do better." As we prepared to leave, Pastor Rebecca Martinez approached us. "Emma, that was extraordinary. You have a gift for teaching, for helping people understand. Have you considered that maybe God is calling you to ministry?" Emma looked thoughtful. "I already do ministry. I just didn't know it had a name." On the drive home, Emma was quieter than usual. Finally, she spoke up. "Dad, do you think Mr. Mitchell heard what I said, even though he wasn't there?" "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Miss Sarah said some people from the old church told people at his new church about my talk. Do you think maybe he learned that hitting kids with autism is wrong?" I considered how to answer. "I hope so, Em. I hope he learned that hitting any kid is wrong." "I forgive him," Emma said simply. "I'm still sad that he hit me, and I'm still glad we found a better church, but I forgive him because that's what Jesus would do." Her capacity for forgiveness continued to amaze me. At 8 years old, Emma had a wisdom and grace that many adults never achieve. 6 months later, I received an unexpected piece of mail. The return address was from a law office in Birmingham, and inside was a letter that surprised me. "Dear Mr. Thompson and Emma, my name is Robert Mitchell, Jr. I am Robert Mitchell's son, and I am writing to you on behalf of my father. Over the past 18 months, my father has been attending counseling and anger management classes as part of his court-ordered requirements. He has also been volunteering at the Autism Society of Alabama, where he has learned about autism spectrum disorders and met many families like yours. My father asked me to write this letter because he wanted you to know that he understands now how wrong his actions were. He knows that autism is not a behavioral problem or a spiritual failing, but a neurological difference that requires understanding and accommodation. He also wanted you to know that he has been following Emma's advocacy work through news coverage and social media posts from Grace Community Church. He is proud of the young woman she is becoming and the positive impact she is having on churches throughout Alabama. My father does not expect forgiveness, nor is he asking to contact you directly. He simply wanted you to know that Emma's courage in speaking about her experience has changed not only his understanding, but the understanding of many others. He has asked me to include a donation to Grace Community Church's Special Needs Ministry in Emma's honor. Sincerely, Robert Mitchell, Jr. I read the letter twice, then showed it to Emma. She read it carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Dad, this means Mr. Mitchell learned better, right?" "It sounds like he did." "Good. That's what I hoped would happen." She handed the letter back to me and returned to her homework, as if receiving apology letters from the man who'd assaulted her was just another part of her day. That Sunday, I shared the letter with Pastor Jennifer and our small group at Grace Community Church. The discussion that followed was rich and meaningful, about forgiveness, about growth, about the power of speaking truth even when it's difficult. "Emma," said Maria Santos, Miguel's mother, "you've become quite the advocate for kids like you. Have you thought about what you want to do with that gift?" Emma looked around the circle of adults who had become our chosen family. "I want to help churches be better places for all kids, not just kids with autism, but kids who are different in any way." "Like a consultant?" asked David Kim. "What's a consultant?" "Someone who helps organizations solve problems and do things better." Emma's eyes lit up. "Yes, I want to be a church consultant, but I also still want to be a veterinarian. Can I do both?" The adults laughed, but it was warm, encouraging laughter. In this community, Emma's dreams, no matter how ambitious, were supported and celebrated. As we drove home that evening, Emma said, "Dad, do you ever miss our old church?" It was a question she asked periodically, and my answer had evolved over time. "I miss some of the people," I said honestly. "I miss Miss Sarah and a few others who were kind to us, but I don't miss feeling like we had to hide parts of who you are to be accepted." "I don't miss it either," Emma said. "I like being able to be myself at church." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." 2 years after that terrible Sunday at Riverside Baptist, Emma stood on the stage of the Alabama Baptist Convention's annual meeting, addressing over 1,000 church leaders about autism acceptance and inclusion. At 10 years old, she had become one of the youngest advocates for neurodiversity in religious communities. Her presentation was polished, but still authentically Emma, direct, honest, and filled with the kind of wisdom that comes from lived experience. "Churches are supposed to be places where everyone feels loved and welcome," she told the audience. "But sometimes churches forget that everyone includes kids like me. When churches remember that God made all kinds of minds and all kinds of bodies, they become better at showing God's love to everyone." The standing ovation she received lasted nearly 5 minutes. As we drove home from Montgomery that evening, Emma fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the excitement of the day. I thought about the journey we'd taken, from that small church where my daughter was seen as a problem to be solved, to stages where she was celebrated as a voice for change. The pain of that Sunday morning would always be part of our story. But it was no longer the end of our story. It had become the catalyst for something beautiful. Emma's emergence as an advocate, our discovery of true community, and the positive changes happening in churches across Alabama and beyond. Emma stirred as we pulled into our driveway. "Dad, are you proud of me?" "Every single day, sweetheart. Every single day. Even when I have meltdowns. Especially when you have meltdowns, because they remind me how hard you're working to navigate a world that isn't always built for brains like yours." "I love you, Dad. I love you too, Emma. More than you'll ever know." As I carried my sleeping daughter into our house, the house we'd been able to buy with the money from her speaking engagements and the consulting work that had grown out of her advocacy, I reflected on how much had changed. Emma was no longer the scared 7-year-old who wondered if she was bad, because she was different. She was a confident, articulate young woman who knew her worth and was using her voice to help others. And I was no longer the father desperately trying to make his child fit into spaces that weren't meant for her. I was the father who helped create new spaces where she could thrive. The last entry in my journal that night simply read, "Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the foundation for the best things we do." Emma's pain became her purpose. Our rejection became our mission. And our story of being cast out became a story of calling others in. She's 10 years old and she's already changing the world. I can't wait to see what she does next.